to The Best Ever, a unique wrestling analysis podcast from Pro Wrestling Musings.com, looking at some of the best ever wrestling matches through the eyes of some of the best ever fans. I'm Craig from Pro Wrestling Musings.com, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Sam from Wrestling Headlines. Small mistake there already, Sam, but we're just going to keep going because these things happen.
I've written a few things for Pro Wrestling Musings, so just keep sliding on through.
How are you doing today, Sam?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Not bad. Quite nervous. This is my first kind of solo hosting podcast for a while. I do not have Griff to rely on, so this will be a little more kind of DIY than one of Griff's professional podcasts are, but there we go. So, Sam, would you like to introduce yourself a bit? Who are you, and why might you have ended up on a wrestling podcast?
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sam. I've been writing about wrestling since 2017. I've been a fan.
Good year to start.
It was a good year to start. Yeah, it was the thing that got me started writing. I kind of dipped back into fandom, back into wrestling fandom in 2014. I always say that Daniel Bryan brought me back to wrestling, but it was Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins that sort of kept me in there. So that the first pay-per-view I ever watched back was the Elimination Chamber, and I was completely awestruck by the Shield triple threat. Sorry, not the Shield triple threat, the Shield and Wyatt's 3-man tag. And from there, I really dug into Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose story, and it was their reunion that stopped me writing about cycling. I was doing live blogging of the Tour de France at the time, and made me want to write about wrestling. And I've been writing on, it was formerly Lords of Pain, and now is Wrestling Headlines since then. And I've done various stuff around and about, but yeah, more recently have been really enjoying digging into some of the stuff you guys have been putting out in Pro Wrestling Musings, and sort of contributing every now and again to the podcast and the roundtables that you do. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here, and really excited to look at to take that sort of statistical analysis on what I think is a very important match in terms of the legacy of where professional wrestling's ended up, particularly in the WWE. Spoiler alert if you haven't looked at the title already, Ultimate Warrior versus the Macho King Randy Savage from Wrestlemania 7.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been wrestling for a while. No, you've not been wrestling for a while. You've been writing about wrestling for a while. You've not been wrestling as far as I know, unless I've missed something. Do you have like a piece of writing that you've done that kind of sticks out as like the bit that you're most proud of, or was your favorite piece of writing to do?
I put out a thing a while ago. If anyone really wants to dig into my Twitter, I'd been writing weekly, and I sort of decided to take a pause on doing it weekly because it had just drained me doing it for 3 years. And I put out a thing that was my favorite columns that I'd ever written, and the one that always stands out to me personally is a column I wrote called "It's the Night It Was Still Real to Me," which is about my personal favorite match ever, which was I've got one of my best friends from uni, he's a wrestler, and he went through this he had a really traumatic knee injury when he was wrestling, and there was a point where the doctors were saying we don't know if you're ever going to walk again, let alone wrestle, and he came back and he won the local indie championship, heavyweight championship, and it was a giant, well, not a giant, it was a giant thing for him. It's the smallest thing ever because it's Hunter Valley Wrestling. Like it was at a club where if the wrestlers jumped too high, they'd hit the roof off the turnbuckle. Right, so but for him it was the hugest thing ever, and the way they built the match was brilliant. Like it's honestly a brilliant match. Even if you don't know any of the backstory, and that's a piece that I'm very proud of. And I've got a number of different columns I used to do at the end of the year called The Stories That Defined 2018, 2019, or at the end of the decade, I did The Stories That Defined the Decade. And I've always loved those because I put a lot of effort into them to, really tell the story and really dig into it. Particularly one that I was very proud of was a the Tanahashi Okada one I did for kind of chronicling their feud. So, I'd say either of those two would be the columns I'd point to if anyone wanted to see what I'm personally the most proud of.
Cool. I mean, winning a wrestling championship after being told that you're never going to walk again, that, can tell why that's a big deal to someone, especially if you know the guy. Yeah.
And it was brilliant because it was local, so it was all his friends and family, and the heel they had, Sid Parker. He's someone that's sort of like a mainstay in the Melbourne wrestling scene. He hasn't done things much internationally, but he's wrestled like Pentagon, RVD, and he actually learnt to wrestle with my mate Falco, and so it meant a lot to him as well, and he was just the best heel in that match, just so sadistic. And the reason I call it the night that it was still real to me is because when he clamped on that figure 4, my mate's had his knee reconstructed.
Oh yeah.
And I didn't know, I don't know what it's like to be in a figure 4, but I felt like throwing my beer glass into the ring or jumping obviously I didn't, but it was genuinely, it was very, it blurred lots of lines for me, but it was because it was triumphant in the end, and they put on just the most epic kick out of everything sort of deal, which is what you do when you're telling that kind of story. It was a really special night. So
cool. Right, so let's move along to the Ultimate Warrior versus Randy Savage. This isn't a match that I'd seen before. I'm actually not very good at going back and looking through kind of the real classics of wrestling. So what I found is a very small summary of how we came to get the Ultimate Warrior versus Randy Savage at WrestleMania 7 is that the Macho Man, or Macho King, as he was calling himself at WrestleMania, he caused the Ultimate Warrior to lose his WWF Championship to Sergeant Slaughter by hitting him with a scepter at the 91 Royal Rumble. And this kind of intensified until we got to this point where it was career versus career. Sam, is that a good quick synopsis, or is there anything else that's worth mentioning?
Yeah, look, that's as good as anything. I think it's probably worth mentioning the long-term arc for Randy Savage as well was so obviously the reason I picked this is because I think this is as influential, if not more influential than the Savage Steamboat, which is the WrestleMania classic that everyone thinks of when they think of Randy Savage, because it really did bring that work rate to the work rate kind of style of wrestling into this big mainstream WWF extravaganza, WrestleMania 3, the biggest wrestling event ever at that point, and what was for a long time. And that did have a huge influence. But for me, I think this is like almost the prototypical, what I'd call WrestleMania epic match. And that's why I picked this. And I think it's important to know like the sort of the arc of Randy Savage in terms of how he, after WrestleMania 3, obviously he won the title at WrestleMania 4, and then they had the Mega Powers with him and Hulk Hogan, and eventually he turned on Hulk Hogan and became a heel. He became consumed with his own arrogance, consumed with jealousy, and one of the big things in that was, of course, his relationship with Miss Elizabeth, which disappeared, became non-existent, and as he slid further and further into his own vanity, essentially, he picked up the Sherry, who is the person that accompanies him to the ring in this match. So this is the Macho. He's no longer just the Macho Man. He's the Macho King. And his ego is just rampant and out of control in this match. And he comes to the ring carried, in the vein of Charlotte Flair. On the shoulders, on a throne, sitting on a throne, on the shoulders of a number of men. I guess that would be sort of the broader character arc for him. And big part of this story is how his ego has just got out of control, and particularly in the ending when everything comes crashing down. But we'll get to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really helpful synopsis. And it's really interesting that you talk about this as being like the original WrestleMania epic, because after watching this match, I labeled it as a very sports entertainment match, which is probably what Vince McMahon would want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. And just to jump in there, also another reason I just remembered that I'd picked this is because I think Randy Savage is an absolute wrestling genius and was famous for meticulously mapping out his matches and rehearsing them. And gosh knows with Warrior, he needed to make sure that he mapped it out and rehearsed it to get a good match out of it.
Absolutely.
I was interested to see, given how analytical you get with breaking down these matches, how that mapped out. Because he is so meticulous, I expected to see a very defined arc and some very defined numbers in the statistics. So and I thought that would be interesting to see, specifically for someone who was that way in laying out his matches.
Yeah, well, let's just go straight to that kind of main point of what we're doing here. So when you look at the Warrior versus Savage and their statistics, they're very opposing. The Ultimate Warrior more than doubles Randy Savage's strikes in the match with 50 compared to 22. 26 of those 50 strikes were strike downs, which means he dropped Savage to the mat. So that's 56% of his strike downs. A kind of an average strike down rate would be something between like 10 and 30%. So this is really high. He also outdid him for grapples, 5 compared to 2. Randy Savage hit 6 dives. Ultimate Warrior hit none. There were 0 submission attempts from Ultimate Warrior. Randy Savage was able to apply 1 submission hold, and he did so for 72 seconds. So that submission hold went for over a minute. Ultimate Warrior with 11 reversals compared to 6 from Randy Savage, but that was because Randy Savage was using far more fouls. He took control of the offense by using fouls quite often, sometimes things like eye rakes, sometimes through interference, so it was 18-1 in favor of Savage there. Loads and loads of taunting and showmanship from both men, 27 times from Ultimate Warrior compared to 15 from Randy Savage. I've also been trying to incorporate a new category called big offense. Often in wrestling matches, the man that dominates the offense doesn't tend to really dominate how the match goes. And this is often because they throw lots of like little strikes. The best example of this is in the famous Lance Archer versus Marco Stunt match, where Lance Archer essentially obliterated Marco Stunt. Marco Stunt technically had more of the match offense because at every opportunity he got, he like windmill struck Lance Archer. So yeah, if we're doing like pedantic numbers, then Marco Stunt dominated that match, which is nonsense. So quite often what you find is the big offense tells you what really happens in the match. And in this match, there were 31 instances of big offense from Ultimate Warrior. So the 26 strike downs plus the 5 grapples. And then for Randy Savage, he hit 22. So the strike downs, the grapples, the dives, and then I was added on 1 more for every 10 seconds of submission, just to kind of even it out there. So this match is kind of dominated by Ultimate Warrior in terms of the numbers, but then when we look at finishers, Randy Savage did hit 5 of his elbows off the top, which, you know, probably that was a big moment in the match where Ultimate Warrior was down. Sam, from your memory of this match, are any of these numbers surprising? Do any of them jump out as significant?
No, I think within the context of the story of the match and the clash of the two characters, I think it matches up perfectly, which sort of adds to my hypothesis that Randy Savage is a wrestling genius. Because, where you've got these two characters, you've got Randy Savage, who, even though his ego is completely out of control, he's a very canny, very smart wrestler, and who knows his strengths and knows what he needs to do. And on the other side, you've just got this bombastic, frenetic ball of energy that is the Ultimate Warrior that, he doesn't run to the ring in this match, which is kind of a thing that the commentators point out because of his intensity.
They made a big deal of that,
Yeah, but typically, runs to the ring, and anyone who's seen Ultimate Warrior promo will know exactly, the sort of energy that this guy puts out. And, that walking to the ring is almost like, well, he's conserving himself because he wants to, this feud has gotten so intense that he just wants to explode on to Randy Savage. And that's exactly what this shows in just about every category. The Warrior is dominating. He almost doubles him in strikes, triples him in strike downs, more than triples him in strike downs, more the grapples, and literally the submissions is like Randy Savage holding on for dear life, trying to reverse, trying to get out. And then of course you've got the the taunts is an interesting one, because I'm not sure how you countered that. There's a lot of drama in this match that I'm not sure if that you may have counted as taunts, where the Warrior is sort of starting to question himself after, Savage kicks out of his some of his big offense. I'm not sure if I'd class that as a taunt or not, but or if you did that or not.
I counted a lot of the stuff where he was like talking to his hands.
Yep.
So the taunting category.
That's where Shawn Michaels learned it from.
Yeah. So the taunting category, this was something I actually spoke to about a friend about, and he suggested that I should have something for like taunting or showmanship, and that's kind of where this came from. So a lot of the stuff where he was kind of talking to his hands, I did put in as taunts. What's the rationale for that? Because it's kind of, I suppose, a lot of how I put this together comes from years and years as a kid of playing old wrestling games. And a lot of the time the taunting is like when they're G'ing themselves up. So I suppose that is a way that Ultimate Warrior is G'ing himself up in the kind of bizarre kind of headcanon of him talking to his gods, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting point.
Yeah, I think these statistics more than sort of break down the way that I would expect them to, given the two characters that are involved. I'm curious because obviously there's as you said, there's the 5 elbows in sequence, which the Warrior then kicks out of. I'm not sure. Obviously, you haven't watched this match before, so you're probably not aware. But within certain wrestling communities I've been involved in, that's a very controversial moment that some people do not like at all. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, given this was the first time you'd watched that match and sort of you hadn't necessarily been exposed to these characters a whole lot.
I have actually highlighted that as part of my conversation points on my notes. What did I write down? So, well, do you know what? I've compared it directly to Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns at WrestleMania when everybody was assuming Roman Reigns was going to win. So this was in their 1v1 match. It was the same WrestleMania that
coming off. The other.
The same WrestleMania that Nakamura lost to AJ Styles, so it was a good WrestleMania for booking.
I wouldn't call that so much as divisive as universally hated.
So I've kind of compared it to that. It's like, well, Lesnar hit Reigns with maybe 7 F5 by the end of that match.
It was incredible. It was insane.
And what feels like might be sacrilege, I've also compared this to The Fiend and that match with Seth Rollins in the Hell in a Cell, where, and I kind of did that because it was the most obvious things that kind of sprung to mind. But a lot of people get really angry at The Fiend for being universe breaking. And when I was quickly rewatching this morning, that was kind of the phrase that came about, is the Ultimate Warrior not universe breaking? Like, he's talking to his hands and his gods are giving him the power to kick out of 5 finishers?
Yeah. So I'm guessing by that you weren't so much of a fan of it.
I didn't mind it. I think if I was watching it at the time and I was wanting to be invested in it, then I would be like, well, what's Savage supposed to do? But I think because I was looking at it as a past match, I didn't. It was interesting, and I wanted to see what happened next. So I didn't actually mind it. However, I do think that you could very easily apply the same criticisms that people throw out against the Fiend's character to the Ultimate Warrior, kind of fueled by his god's character.
Well, look, I'm not a Warrior fan by any stretch of the imagination. This is like one of the few matches of his that I love, and the reason I love it, I think, is solely because of the genius of Randy Savage carrying this Hulk of a useless worker to his best match ever. But I don't know. For me, in the flow of the match, because normally I wouldn't like something like this. Like I definitely didn't like that WrestleMania match with the Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns. And I typically am not a fan of something unless it's really required. I don't like the sequential, like the constant kick out epic. I feel like there's other things you can do to build drama in a match rather than just constantly kicking out a big move for big move. But in the flow of this match, the way I sort of see it, actually, if you want to go on to the next slide with the match progress, you can sort of see that, and even it plays out in those numbers that you read out. The strikes and the strike downs, the big offense, the strike down rate, the Warrior is just absolutely dominating. And the only thing that's keeping Savage in this match is, firstly, his technical ability to just grab some offense at any point. Secondly, his liberal interpretation of the rules, him and Sherry's interferences at different points, where they're able to just grab a cheap, hit a cheap shot, grab onto to something or hit something to damage this sort of onslaught that is happening and slow this onslaught. And so I've kind of loved that when he finally gets the Warrior down enough that he can do something, he just is like, I've just got to unload every single thing I have right now, and doesn't even go for pinfalls in between. And just he marches, hits one, the move that would normally end a match. And this was an era where, this wasn't something that was normal. Hits 2, hits 3, hits 4, hits 5. And you can tell the crowd are just losing it at this point because they're used to seeing 1 or 2 of these end a match. And he hits 5 of them, and then the Warrior kicks out. And for me, within the flow of the match, with him so desperate, in such a desperate act where he's like just immediately going to this one after the other, and then the Warrior, because of career, and he's just taking it so intensely, having the fortitude to kick out of it, even though it's such an intense thing. I don't know. For me, in the moment, it works so well, particularly given Savage's trajectory, where he's on a downward slide with, where he's at. And he is just desperate to maintain his career because he wants to maintain this, he wants to maintain his ego, essentially. He wants to maintain his arrogance that is out of control, and he needs to be humbled. And this is the humility that he's going to get. In the moment, it's, I don't know, I think I love this moment. Even though as I said, I think this is one of the more influential matches out there. Even if it's created a trend that I don't specifically love anymore, or I don't tend to love. but because
I
it's the
suppose
way
it
it's
has to be.
implemented in this match. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it has to be earned. Like
Yeah.
I didn't dislike the match,
Mm.
and I suppose, see, I can't switch my critical brain off. Um, I didn't dislike this, and I didn't necessarily dislike that moment. I suppose when I'm watching wrestling, there's always like a bit in the back of your head that just kind of goes, well, this is a bit silly, or this is a bit unrealistic. I always kind of go back to watching like SmackDown as a teenager, and it was Brock Lesnar and the Big Show against the Undertaker in for some reason in a handicap match, and I would guess Lesnar was the champion at the time, and he was backed by some kind of authority figure, and the Undertaker was like his challenger. And the Undertaker wins that match. The Undertaker beats Brock Lesnar and the Big Show. And I can just remember sitting there, why would I expect the Undertaker not to beat Lesnar in their eventual match? Is Brock Lesnar so bad now that he can't even beat the Undertaker on his own? And I suppose when you're a wrestling fan, because it gets a lot of kind of derision from a lot of people, even within the community, and because it has this label of fake, you're always kind of needing it to justify itself in being convincing. And I often think that the standard for a good wrestling story can be quite low. And I think that's because of, WWE ruining everything for years. People are talking about how great AEW is because it all makes sense. And it does all make sense. But sometimes I wonder that bar is just a little bit too low.
Yeah.
And the reason I question
if
this
the bar
match,
is it's all meant to make sense, it's pretty low.
Yeah, I know. Somebody watches Raw and there's a pinfall and everybody starts celebrating. I suppose I would say that maybe that same effect could have been achieved by Randy Savage hitting one and then Warrior kicks out, and then Randy Savage hits another and maybe Warrior kicks out. But I'm only saying that with somebody that's not able to switch their critical brain off. As somebody watching the match like 30 years later, I wasn't angry. I didn't have any emotional investment in it. I was you're watching it from the future with a completely different set of ideals, and like I really enjoyed the match. It was a really cool spectacle. And seeing these two really famous workers at WrestleMania with the crowd who were going
calling
mad.
Warrior a worker is
Sorry?
calling Warrior a worker is stretching the definition a little
bit. Probably, but like he was doing his job, because every single time he turned the tide, the crowd went absolutely crazy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I suppose that's why I kind of made perhaps big comparisons to The Fiend. I suppose The Undertaker's maybe a better comparison.
Well, I was one of the questions I was sort of thinking of asking towards the end of this was what other wrestler could do a Warrior like sort of performance or persona now. And I think The Fiend I didn't think of The Fiend, to be honest, but I think that's a fantastic comparison, particularly in like how overpowered he could be, and how he's, living in his own little world as well. The other one I thought of actually was Miro, particularly with him doing this God's favorite champion, incorporating a lot of, biblical imagery, religious imagery into his promos, particularly in this match where towards the end, of course, the Warrior hits his finish, which is normally always got it done for him, and Savage kicks out, and the Warrior's questioning his very existence. So just as where Savage has that,
that's the bit where he's going to leave, isn't it?
Yeah. He's questioning the gods that have always helped him triumph, and suddenly he can't anymore, and he's talking to his hands, talking to the ropes, going looking at the sky. It's all very melodramatic, but I don't know. directly after the such a dramatic moment where Savage hits these elbows one after the other. I don't know. I feel like it fits. This is a very melodramatic match, even in the the very end and in the post match. It is popcorn wrestling for sure. But yeah, I was thinking, could Miro do something like that down the line? You know, when something happens, he comes up against someone, say Eddie Kingston or I don't know, whoever he might come up against, Darby Allin maybe, and he can't get the job done, and all of a sudden this guy who's saying that he's God's favorite champion is now questioning if God is still on his side.
Start shouting at the heavens or something in the middle of the match. That'd be really cool.
Work or not, but I was thinking who else could do that. But I think the Fiend is probably a better comparison actually. Or Warrior.
I feel like the Undertaker's character and the way that he was presented in matches is a more convincing version of this. Maybe not convincing, but like a more in scale. Like the Undertaker was almost always this like undead, powerful being, and he seemed to draw power from somewhere, but he was beatable to an extent. Whereas I just felt that hitting 5 of a finisher that has beat so many guys was overkill. And it was a bit like, you know, the Brock Lesnar stuff or the Fiend stuff. And when I was younger, I did like watching The Undertaker, and I really, really loved the character. Whereas as an adult watching old Undertaker matches, I don't have the same feeling, but I don't feel like my intelligence is being insulted like I do when I watch The Fiend or The Undertaker, or you know, those Goldberg squashes or those kind of things.
Well, early on, The Undertaker was a very to use a wrestling term, protected character, like he never lost, he never lost, in fact. I think and he would absorb the offense of the opposition and the person opposite him, and this was actually in this era, like the Undertaker was active at this point as well. So you know, those same booking tropes that are kind of coming in for Warrior are what were affecting were being used for Undertaker and deployed for Undertaker at this point for it. And it's not a comparison I'd thought of really before, Undertaker or Warrior, because I think because Undertaker went on to do so much more. You know, the Undertaker very much in it's primarily his feud with Mick Foley really took his character in a very different direction that Warrior never did, and then obviously down the line became a much more beatable and a much more human character that, you know, people, audiences could relate to. Kind of pretty much. He was always, obviously always a very protected character, you know, and always a character that was very much at the top of the pecking order. And if you beat the Undertaker, he was considered a big deal, but he wasn't the sort of one-dimensional, or not even one-dimensional, but the sort of just unbeatable, unconquerable force, indomitable force of Warrior. You know, the Warrior was, and he was early in his career.
What is interesting about this match, and it probably goes back to your point about Randy Savage being a terrific worker, is the flow of offense does kind of follow what is a more or less a classic match pattern. So if we're looking at the flow of offense minute by minute, it starts off with quite a hot start from your babyface. For the first 6 minutes, you've got Ultimate Warrior getting in some really, really big offense. 4 of his 5 grapples came during that period, lots of strike downs. He's very, very on top of Randy Savage, who is surviving with like fouls and the odd strike here or there. Then Randy Savage kind of gets back into it, hits a grapple, gets some help from Sherry, all these kind of things. Eventually grounds him down. Around 8 minutes, he's starting to get that submission on for a while. As you can see, Ultimate Warrior's kind of totals are far, far lower. Then eventually he hits all those finishers. Ultimate Warrior kicks out, and
Giant
then
spike in the
yes,
minute
yes,
offense.
huge spike in the offense.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Ultimate Warrior kind of come back and winning the match. This is what a lot of people describe as the classic flow. You know, babyface, ground down by heel dominates for a bit, babyface comeback, finish. I'm assuming we're giving the credit to that to Randy Savage, and the Ultimate Warrior didn't all of a sudden become Ric Flair for the evening.
Oh, look, I've been pretty harsh on Warrior. I probably shouldn't be, but yeah, look, as I said, Savage was famous for meticulously plotting out and practicing and rehearsing his matches. Even the match with Steamboat, they said they rehearsed that beforehand, and I have no doubt that he took Warrior, you know, through this a number of times before they did it. So, and you know, given that he's planning it out, it's and wants to create, you know, this epic match. I have no doubt that that's what he mapped it into, that sort of classic. As I said, the Warrior comes out very intense, wanting to explode, and that matches the story they've had, where Savage has gotten under the Warrior's skin, has you know, fouled the Warrior and wronged the Warrior. So of course the Warrior is going to be there, and then Savage, through his canny, takes over, tries to get it done, unloads as much as he can, can't do it, and then the Warrior. But because of, I think, you do have the extra added on part. There isn't just, you know, Savage hits his big moves and then the Warrior comes back and wins. It's Savage hits his big moves, the Warrior comes back.
Yeah.
But because it's this career-ending thing, because there's so much on the line, Savage is able to push through that initial comeback from Warrior, and that's when the Warrior sort of questions what's going to happen, which is, you know, imagine walking out of a retirement match. Like, his career's on the line and he's contemplating walking out on it, but then he goes, no. He's moved by the crowd. He's moved by the wrestling gods and gets the job done against Savage, who is left at the end bereft, having tried everything, having unloaded everything he could possibly ever expect to put something down, and has nothing left. And then he gets attacked by Sherry, who embodies everything that's wrong with his character. You know, Miss Elizabeth leaving him and being replaced by Sherry is, you know, like that embodies his slide into his own ego, his own vanity. And at that point, because she's lost her meal ticket, even she leaves him. He's just completely humiliated and humbled.
And that kind of finish, that was like, the emotions behind that was huge. There were people, when Elizabeth went back to Savage, there were people like crying in the crowd. I guess for those of you who haven't watched the match, there's this amazing moment at the end where it's not made, they don't make a giant deal of it, as I think they're fairly subtle with it, actually. The commentator, they notice it's a surprise that Elizabeth is there at the start. The commentator's like, wait, is that Elizabeth in the crowd? And it's a surprise that she's there. And the wrestlers don't acknowledge her at all during the match. The commentators mention it maybe once or twice, and it maybe cuts to her once or twice. But at the end, Miss Elizabeth, the person who represents everything that was once good with the Macho Man Randy Savage, runs to the ring to when Savage has lost everything, to reunite with him, and he accepts her. And not only does he accept her, one of the things in his character early on was Elizabeth would open the ropes for him. And this time it isn't about Elizabeth, you know, pandering to him. He opens the ropes for her. And as you said, people are weeping. It's very emotional. So just quickly going back, we also have a cumulative flow of offense. And this was something that was actually suggested to me by some random person on Reddit. And they said that you could like add them together, which is interesting. So this is essentially just the previous slide. This is the flow of offense, and it's just adding up those numbers rather than going back to zero each minute. But what this actually works out really satisfyingly for this match. You can see the Ultimate Warrior builds up a bit of a lead in terms of how much damage he's done to Savage. By 6 minutes, it's quite a gap. Then for the next kind of 7 minutes, Randy Savage is very, very slowly closing the gap. Warrior's still getting a little bit in. Then around the 13th to 15th minute, you can see the huge jump as Randy Savage hits all of his finishes. And then the next bit of the match is the Ultimate Warrior kind of working back, hitting his finish, and you can see that Randy Savage isn't really getting much in at all there in those last sort of 5 minutes. So that's really satisfying as well. That's almost a perfect kind of image to come out. Quite often when I put this slide together, it's really just a wrestler opens up a gap, then the wrestler closes it a bit and the gap gets bigger, and you often don't really have the lines touching or crossing. So it's really cool that you can see that, you know, one of them had to catch up, and it was a huge amount of effort for Randy Savage to catch up the Ultimate Warrior, and he then threw everything he could at him, 5 of his finishers, and couldn't do it. Ultimate Warrior gets over the line with his God's help, or however you want to interpret it.
Yeah, look, what can I say? Randy Savage is a wrestling genius.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next bit we have is because the hardest way of comparing wrestling matches is because all the matches have different time limits. And what you will find is matches that have the biggest numbers tend to go the longest. So the way that I have ended up trying to flatten that out is by adding a per hour kind of rate to it. And this came from like football stats. I play a lot of Football Manager, or I used to when I had time. And quite often what they do is you see like who's the top goal scorer in the league. But what they also do to add a little bit of context is they do goals per match, or goals per 90. So you might see that, you know, Harry Kane has scored 22 goals and he's got the most goals, but underneath him, Mohamed Salah has got 20 goals, but he's played less matches than Harry Kane. So he's actually a more valuable goal scorer. Yeah, because he scores more often. So that's what I've tried to do here. So it's quite hard to just look at these per hour rates without any context and make anything of it. So what I've done is I've pulled out 3 other matches that I had. The Rock versus Hulk Hogan, which is another WrestleMania match, goes 16 minutes, so it's sort of similar. I've got Gargano versus Cole, because it's a one-on-one match in the WWE, kind of, on a big stage. And I've also added in Utami Hayashishita versus Shuri from Stardom recently, because it's kind of one of the more state-of-the-art matches that I had that's also worth comparing. So we now have kind of all of these rates of offense for these 8 wrestlers based on these matches. So what we can now do is we can compare them. So for example, the Ultimate Warrior, if you were to take his performance against Randy Savage and kind of multiply it up, so in the perspective as if he was wrestling an hour, he would have hit 190 strikes in that time frame, whereas Randy Savage would have only hit 84. So we can now compare that with the other 3 matches that we have. The Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage's rates of striking are both really interesting, because the Ultimate Warrior's is really, really high and Randy Savage's is really, really low. When we look at the other competitors we have there's only one of those 8 wrestlers that has a lower strike rate than Randy Savage, and that's Johnny Gargano in a match that went almost 40 minutes. And what I've also found is the longer a match goes, the lower these rates of offense are, because they sell more and there's a lot more. This has been going on ages. They're lying down more. So it's really interesting that almost emphasizes how little Randy Savage was striking, Ultimate Warrior, because that's his wrestling style, or because his character knew that he couldn't outstrike Ultimate Warrior, however you want to interpret that. And on the other end of the scale, you've got Ultimate Warrior's 190 strikes per hour, which is higher than every other wrestler, again, on our slide, including The Rock and Hogan, whose match was a lot of them kind of just trading strikes. The only wrestler...
Shuri.
Yes, the only wrestler was Shuri, which isn't surprising to Stardom fans because Shuri is a terrifying striker. She used to be an MMA fighter. So, again, it's not too surprising that she's the only one that was outstriking the Ultimate Warrior. Sam, is there any other rates of offense there from any of these two wrestlers that stands out as significant when you kind of compare them to these other matches or wrestlers as a kind of touchstone?
Two things popped out to me when I was looking at these and comparing them. The first and the interesting one, you brought out the strikes. In the one that has, as lower strikes, Johnny Gargano in his match with Adam Cole. It's interesting that is for completely the opposite reason that Randy Savage is doing that in the Gargano-Cole match. Obviously, Gargano is the face, and the reason he's getting in such low strikes is because he's getting beaten down by Adam Cole, the heel. However, in this match, it's Randy Savage, the heel, is getting beaten down by the Ultimate Warrior, who's this, just on an onslaught, and he's just, flat out trying to get anything in as he sort of tries to survive what's coming at him from Warrior, and he, I guess, gets his offense in differently. But I thought that was interesting that they're on the completely different sides of the ledger, but and they're the two lowest. The other one that I thought was a really interesting comparison was The Rock versus Hogan, because as I said, I think this match is the prototypical WrestleMania epic. You've had matches before like like Hogan versus Andre, which is sort of in the lore that is the WrestleMania main event. But I think this is where the modern styling of what I'd call the epic comes from, and Rock versus Hogan is very much in that vein. And the interesting comparison, I thought, was the finishes per minute, where you've got The Rock, who is not necessarily because he went into this match as a face, right? And he wasn't necessarily playing a heel, but in the same way that Savage is sort of coming up against this indomitable force, The Rock is coming up against Hulk Hogan, like in the WWE, in WrestleMania. Like there could not be a more imposing figure, and both of them are just unloading finishes at an insanely high rate. So they hit 15. The Rock is 15 finishes per hour. Savage is 19 finishes per hour. The other ones,
just for the sake of the information, The Rock hits 4 finishers against Hulk Hogan. One of them was a rock bottom earlier on that Hulk Hogan kicked out of. To end the match, he hit 2 rock bottoms and then the people's elbow.
So once again, someone who needs to completely unload to try and bring down this gargantuan force that's against him. By comparison, you've got in the Utami versus Shuri, 1 finisher versus 3 per hour, and then Gargano versus Cole, which gets derided for finisher kickouts. There's only 5 and 3, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on there that's not necessarily finishes, where you've got the Undisputed Era running in, and I don't know if you mapped Kyle O'Reilly and Bobby Fish and Roddy Strong hitting their finishes onto that as well, or not. No, I don't think so.
That's hard to know what to do in that
push
situation.
The number out.
I didn't.
And I guess that kind of counts as fouls.
I do, but that's another thing that comes into it.
Double point foul where they hit a finisher and they're interfering. Anyway, that's up to you. But I thought that was interesting, just the comparison between Rock Hogan and Warrior Savage, particularly with the lineage that I sort of drive and sort of see this match having Warrior Savage, which I think, not only Rock Hogan, I think you'd, Stone Cold versus The Rock, you'd have Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker, Triple H versus The Undertaker. I think you'd probably find Daniel Bryan, CM Punk, basically any of the big ones against The Undertaker. But also, just off the top of my head, thinking about it, obviously Brock Lesnar versus Roman Reigns has that sort of that epic. Well, that I guess they try and make it that epic thing to it.
Try too hard,
Or even Daniel Bryan versus the Batista and
Evolution, yeah.
Batista and, having one side just layering in the finishes and the other, having to absorb it and come back for the victory. Yeah. I'm sure that some John Cena matches would fit that as well.
Probably, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing in this match that really jumps out is obviously the Ultimate Warrior's strike down rate. And so he's hitting 99 strike downs per hour, which is a satisfying number in itself. But the biggest one there that rivals him is Hulk Hogan's 40.
Yeah.
What else is there?
That comparison between the two of them. Yeah.
Shuri 35 per hour, The Rock 15 per hour. That's a huge, huge deficit from the Ultimate Warrior. And I mean, after watching the match, it's not surprising, 52% of his strikes are strike downs. That was the main way that they kind of put the Ultimate Warrior over. He hit 4...
It's his main offense.
Yeah, well, yeah, he hit 4 grapples really early. He ends the match just by repeatedly, essentially shoulder barging Randy Savage until he just can't get up anymore. Oh yeah, and he puts his foot on his chest to end the match, which is another kind of big thing that they did here. Well,
as I said, the story of this is the humbling of the Macho King, and what is more humbling than that?
Yeah, absolutely. What else jumps out? Lots of submission and dives from Randy Savage. Those numbers are bigger than pretty much anybody else there, except for except for Shuri again, but just ahead of Shuri in terms of submissions, well ahead of everybody else in terms of dives. The grapple numbers here are average to bigger than biggish. And then again, the taunts are the thing that I think stands out here. Both competitors here did more taunts than everybody else, including Randy Savage just pipping The Rock and Hogan with his 57 taunts per hour ahead of 51 and 54 for The Rock and Hogan respectively. Warrior again dwarfing everyone in terms of that with 103 taunts per hour.
Also Savage's fouls.
Absolutely. Yeah. 68 fouls per hour, dwarfing everybody else. Cole with 11 fouls per hour. The Rock with 51 fouls per hour. Sorry, not The Rock. Hogan with 51 fouls per hour. The Rock with 44. So Savage kind of the dirtiest in the time frame there as well. The main thing that I took from this, Sam, was that Randy Savage wrestled a match that is somewhat comparable to a lot of the more modern wrestlers here in terms of his spread of offense and how he used fouls. Whereas the Ultimate Warrior, his style of match is very specific to him as a wrestler. He taunts and he hits strikes and grapples, and that's pretty much it. And I think the stats kind of support that view that I think a lot of people probably had.
Yeah, and I think, definitely Savage was well and truly before his time in terms of, I mean, everyone, as I said at the start, that Steamboat versus Savage match is to this day still praised as a work rate classic. I actually want to see, I'd love to see just two wrestlers go out at an indie show somewhere and just redo that match and see what happens. See how the crowd take it if they just redo that Savage versus Steamboat match and see what happens. I wouldn't say they could definitely do Warrior versus Savage at an indie show, but he's a man who's before his time in terms of his style and the way he thought about wrestling and the way, as I said, like meticulously mapped these out. And I think the reason that we've got such a clear divide is partly that I don't know about Gargano versus Cole, Rock versus Hogan, and Utah versus Shuri, how much is prepared beforehand and how much is called on the fly. I know the Rock and Hogan changed on the fly because the Rock realized what was going on. The crowd was responding to Hogan in a certain way, so they changed the match on the fly. The NXT matches, I mean, at a point, there was a sort of a criticism of NXT that, they'd get to rehearse the matches 20 times before they ever did it. So that's why they were so flawless. So I'm not sure if Gargano and Cole did that or not. But definitely the reason that we've got such defined and I think such a well-structured match is because Randy Savage has planned it all out and has decided for it to be that way.
Absolutely. That is pretty much everything I had on this, Sam. Is there anything else you want to raise in relation to this match? Or is that
No,
quite
as
a
I
neat
said,
bow?
the only other thing I was going to ask at the end
Uh-huh.
was, who is someone that you think could potentially do something like this? What is a pairing that you think could do something like this? My immediate thought was
Mm.
Miro, Miro versus someone. I'm not sure who. Potentially, I mean, you could maybe even get a Kenny Omega, depending what they do with Miro's character. If Miro's character gets to the point where it's because it's definitely gaining traction, right? And if he can
Yeah.
get popular, you've got a champion there who is at the height of his hubris,
Mhm.
and someone who certainly is descending to those depths. I'm not sure if that's an interesting comparison to you or not, but that's just
Yeah.
something that I thought of when I was thinking about what would this
Do
match
you-
look like if it was done today.
So do you mean in terms of like the character work and the kind of the
Even
motivation
the match,
driving one
even
of
the
them?
match structure,
Uh-huh.
and definitely the character work, but the match structure and the sort of wrestlers that they are.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, I think you could probably do something like this. It's on the tip of my tongue because it's so recent, but Alistair Black, Malachi Black jumps out as someone because he's got this kind of undercurrent of story, and I wonder if he maybe steamrollers a few more wrestlers like he's done to Cody, maybe he comes up against somebody and it's not easy, and then you could see him talking to himself in the same way that Warrior did, but I suppose the narrative would just be different in so much that he has his own issues and he's literally talking to himself and trying to, access this evil or whatever it is that his character is convinced is going on. You could do something like that. The other thing
I could certainly see him racking up a strike down rate comparable, but a really high strike down rate given the way his offense is set up.
Yeah, the other one that jumps out is Adam Page. He's got his grand story going on about his kind of struggles with himself, and we see a lot of that backstage, and we see that a lot of that on BTE, but we don't see as much of it more recently in his matches. Like we saw it at the end of his tag team matches with Kenny Omega, and we see it off screen, but I wonder if we see you could do something with Adam Page, perhaps having some kind of, I don't know if you could do a panic attack in the context of a wrestling match, but
that would be interesting.
That's probably in really bad faith. And I before people get mad at me, I say this as somebody who's had a panic attack before. I'm not mocking it.
Yeah.
But like, you could certainly see him having some kind of mental health. You could see him maybe just freaking out and like going to leave. And then the fans geeing him up and him coming back and then perhaps winning. And then the commentary team carry the conversation like, he doesn't believe in himself and blah, blah, blah. And then he does it. I don't know. They
would have to be careful doing that. That would be, but man, that could be very evocative. Yeah.
I think you can do it. And like, or is that triggering? I don't know. It's hard.
I mean, if there is a crowd to carry that sort of, go along with that sort of a narrative, it's the AEW crowd. Like, and particularly with the diehard, like the hardcore's affection for Adam Page is very high. So I think if you're going to do that sort of a thing where he sort of freaks out and is overcome by the moment, I don't know how JR would go with that on commentary.
You wouldn't see Ric Flair, etc. Yeah, absolutely.
Stone Cold Steve Austin wouldn't. Oh gosh.
Well, I don't know. That's what I'm talking about. I think you can. Like, people have been like slagging off WWE for having like writers that are not wrestling fans, but I don't see any problem with inviting writers into the backstage area where they can talk to wrestlers about their storylines. And because there are amazing stories going on in TV and film, and there's absolutely no reason why you can't borrow from these things and try to weave it in. That's generally how a lot of other kind of disciplines like advance. There's lots of stories about Arsene Wenger, who's a famous Arsenal football manager, about how he borrowed from American football teams in terms of how they prepared for matches and nutrition and stuff, and how that was behind a lot of that team's success. And like, every industry does it. There's absolutely no reason why they can't. And this kind of, this kind of criticism of like these new guys that don't get the business kind of quite often annoys me kind of in that way. But
and I think just because something is hard to do and because it hasn't been done before, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be. Because I think that TV writers thing that WWE gets slagged off with, I think is partly because, one, I don't know if they actually get good TV writers, right? Because there's I don't know if any of the TV writers in Hollywood are. Sorry?
The end result needs to be good as well. I don't know what there's a lot TV writers.
Yeah, because there's a lot of mediocre TV shows out there as well. And if they're just getting people who are just doing it for a job, then I don't know. I think wrestling for someone to adapt to wrestling, they'd have to be good at what they do. And two, I think also, obviously in WWE, everything goes through the Vince filter, who is not a TV writer. And love or hate Vince, he's definitely not a TV writer, and we know that I don't know how he would ever handle something like this. Like I dread to think of how a mental health story would go in main roster WWE. Absolutely dread to think of how it would play.
Yeah, out. So that's not something that should ever happen.
Yeah. Where I think we've gone wildly off topic, but very interesting.
That's absolutely. Well, yeah. I also think that this match was one of those matches that was pushing the boundaries at the time. So it does feel like that's probably full circle. So shall we leave it there, Sam?
I'm happy to leave it there.
Brilliant.
Yeah, really, I love this match. If you haven't seen it, I think it's one that's well worth watching. It's about 20 minutes long, and as I've said, Randy Savage is a wrestling genius, a man before his time, a man who was extremely creative and managed to pull it off in an astounding way, and really got the in-ring work stuff, but also got the character work, and for his time, just an incredible wrestler.
And this is a fascinating match as well because it's different. It's very different. Brilliant. So this is the first recording of what I'm hoping is going to be an ongoing series where we look at the best wrestling matches ever. This one certainly fits the bill due to the competitors, how interesting they are. The stage, the crowd is one of the best on its own. Thank you very much, Sam, for joining me. Would you like to tell?
Having me.
You're very welcome. Would you like to tell everyone where they can find you if they want to check out some of your writing or other bits and bobs?
Yeah, so I guess the best place to find anything I do is on Twitter, Sir_Samuel. My writing is predominantly, as I said, I kind of have dabbled in different places around the spot, but the majority of my writing is on wrestlingheadlines.com. You can find it under the column section under Sir Sam's Court. I'm not regularly writing at the moment, but if you do check out anything there, you can see my archive, or when I do post it will go up there in the column section. So yeah, and you can find me, as I said, Twitter, Sir_Samuel. If you've want to talk to me about Randy Savage, about the Ultimate Warrior kicking out of 5 finishes in a row.
Very nice. Absolutely. So please subscribe to the podcast. We should be on all of the podcast places, and go and check out our website at prowrestlingmusings.com. Thank you very much for listening.